April 2, 1878, Milford, County Donegal, Ireland. The body of William Sydney Clements, the 3rd Earl of Leitrim, lies face down in the mud of a country road. 3 bullets have torn through his chest. His skull is fractured from repeated blows. The carriage behind him sits abandoned, its door hanging open. 2 other bodies sprawl nearby, his clerk and his driver, both shot in the back as they tried to flee. But this wasn't a robbery. The Earl's gold watch still hangs from his waistcoat. His wallet remains untouched in his coat pocket. This was an execution, meticulously planned and brutally carried, out in broad daylight on a public road. The local constabulary would later describe the scene as murder most foul, but the hundreds of tenants who lived under the Earl's rule had another word for it: justice. But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Before we uncover the truth about the Earl of Leitrim's assassination and the decades of terror that led to it, make sure to subscribe to Hypnotic Histories and ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's darkest corners. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Ireland, 1840s through 1870s, a nation in perpetual crisis. The Great Famine has devastated the countryside, killing over 1 million people and forcing another million to flee across the Atlantic. Those who remain live under a feudal system that would have seemed archaic even in medieval times. Protestant Anglo-Irish landlords, many of them absentee owners living in London or Dublin, control vast estates worked by Catholic Irish tenants who have no rights, no security, and no hope. This is the world of the landed aristocracy, where men hold the power of life and death over thousands of families, where a landlord's word is law, and the law offers no protection to those beneath them. County Donegal sits in the remote northwest corner of Ireland, a landscape of rugged mountains and windswept coastlines. Beautiful, isolated, and desperately poor. Here, in the townlands of Milford and the surrounding parishes, William Sydney Clements reigns supreme. He is the 3rd Earl of Leitrim, a peer of the realm, a member of the House of Lords, and the master of over 90,000 acres spanning 3 Irish counties. But Lord Leitrim is no ordinary landlord. Born in 1806 into immense wealth and privilege, he inherited his title and estates at age 23. From the beginning, something was different about him. While other landlords at least maintained a veneer of paternalistic concern for their tenants, Leitrim seemed to take active pleasure in their suffering. His contemporaries described him as imperious, vindictive, and utterly without mercy. One Dublin newspaper would later write that he possessed a nature so cruel and despotic that it would have disgraced a Turkish pasha. His estate stretched across Leitrim, Galway, and Donegal. But it was in Donegal, far from Dublin's scrutinizing eyes, that his true character manifested without restraint. The Earl maintained multiple residences, but he spent increasing amounts of time at Milford House, his Donegal estate. Here he could move among his tenants like a medieval lord, demanding absolute obedience and exacting terrible punishment for even the slightest perceived offense. Those who worked his lands quickly learned to fear him. He traveled the roads in a distinctive carriage, always accompanied by his clerk and driver. When tenants saw that carriage approaching, they would scatter into their homes, bolt their doors, and hide their daughters. Because Lord Leitrim's reputation extended beyond mere cruelty in matters of rent and eviction, the whispers had started years before. A young woman summoned to the manor house to discuss her family's overdue rent. She returned home hours later, clothes torn, refusing to speak of what had occurred. A servant girl at Milford House who became pregnant and was immediately dismissed, cast out with no references and no means of support. A tenant farmer who confronted the Earl about his unwanted advances toward the man's 15-year-old daughter, and found his family evicted within the week. Their cottage burned to the ground. The pattern repeated itself across the decades. Young women, usually from the poorest families, those with no power and no recourse. Some were domestic servants. Others were tenants' daughters called to the manor on pretense. All of them learned that to refuse the Earl meant ruin for their entire family. In the rigid class structure of Victorian Ireland, these women had nowhere to turn. The local magistrate, he dined regularly with the Earl. The constabulary, they depended on landlords for their positions. The clergy, even they walked carefully around a man who controlled so much wealth and influence. To accuse an Earl of such crimes was unthinkable. It would be dismissed as slander, as the desperate fabrications of jealous peasants. So the silence continued, and Lord Leitrim's predations escalated. But there was another dimension to his cruelty, one that affected every family on his estates, male and female alike. His management of his property was legendarily vicious. While other landlords at least pretended to care about improving their estates, investing in drainage or better housing, Leitrim extracted every possible penny while spending nothing on improvements. His tenants lived in conditions that shocked even hardened observers. One government inspector described the dwellings on the Leitrim estates as unfit for human habitation, barely weatherproof hovels where entire families sleep on earthen floors with no furniture, no heat, and inadequate food. The Earl's response to such criticism? If they don't like it, they can leave. But leaving meant certain starvation. The famine had taught everyone that lesson. Rent collection days were exercises in terror. The Earl would arrive personally, accompanied by his clerk Charles Buchanan and his driver, along with a contingent of armed men. He would sit in his carriage while tenants lined up to pay. Those who couldn't produce the full amount faced immediate eviction. No grace period, no consideration for illness, crop failure, or family tragedy, and the evictions themselves were spectacles of calculated cruelty. Under Irish law, landlords could evict tenants for non-payment of rent, but they had to follow certain procedures. Lord Leitrim followed the letter of the law while violating its spirit entirely. He would have the constabulary present, making the eviction technically legal. Then his hired men would tear the roof off the cottage while the family watched. They would break down the walls, rendering the structure uninhabitable so the family couldn't sneak back in after dark. The displaced families would gather their few possessions and wander the roads, seeking shelter wherever they could find it. Many ended up in the workhouse, that dreaded institution where families were separated and conditions were deliberately kept harsh to discourage the poor from seeking help. Others simply disappeared into the anonymous mass of Ireland's desperately poor, dying of exposure, disease, or starvation. Lord Leitrim evicted hundreds of families over the decades. By the 1870s, entire townlands on his estates stood empty, the cottages in ruins, the fields reverting to wilderness. He preferred sheep to people. They required less management and generated steady income without complaint. The first serious attempt on the Earl's life came in February 1871. Lord Leitrim was traveling through his Donegal estates when shots rang out from behind a stone wall. 2 bullets struck his carriage. One passed through the seat where he had been sitting moments before. He had bent down to retrieve something from the floor, a movement that saved his life. The constabulary launched an investigation, but they found no witnesses. In a countryside dotted with cottages, on a road traveled daily by dozens of people, somehow no one had seen anything. The conspiracy of silence was complete. The Earl knew what this meant. His tenants weren't just afraid of him anymore. They were beginning to organize against him. He responded predictably. He increased security around his properties, hiring more armed guards. He evicted several families he suspected of harboring the would-be assassin, though he had no evidence against them. And he began carrying a pistol himself, keeping it loaded in his coat pocket, but he refused to change his behavior. If anything, he became more aggressive, as though daring someone to try again. In 1872, another incident occurred that would prove significant in retrospect. A young woman named Margaret McClune, aged 17, was summoned to Milford House. Her father owed rent, and the message said the Earl wished to discuss payment arrangements. Her parents had no choice but to send her. What else could they do? She arrived at the manor house in the afternoon. Hours passed. When she finally emerged as dusk was falling, she walked home in complete silence. Her mother tried to speak with her, but Margaret would say nothing. She went to bed without eating. The next morning, her father found her room empty. She had taken the family's small boat and rowed out into Mulroy Bay during the night. Her body was found 3 days later, washed up on the rocks near Kindram Point. The coroner ruled it a tragic accident. Perhaps she had been fishing and lost her balance. Perhaps the boat had overturned in the darkness. These things happened to young people who took foolish risks, but everyone knew. The whole community knew. Margaret's father, Bernard McClune, became a changed man after his daughter's death. Neighbors reported seeing him sitting outside his cottage at all hours, staring toward Milford House in the distance. He stopped working his small plot of land. He stopped speaking to his wife. He simply sat and stared, day after day. Then, one morning in early 1873, Bernard McClune walked to the nearest town and boarded a ship to America. He left behind his wife, his other children, his entire life. He simply couldn't remain in the same county as the man who had destroyed his daughter. The message was clear to everyone. Confronting the Earl directly was futile. The system protected him completely. He was, in the eyes of the law, untouchable. Throughout 1873 and 1874, the situation continued to deteriorate. Lord Leitrim evicted another 40 families, clearing entire townlands. He was consolidating his estates, preparing to convert more land to grazing. People were obstacles to be removed, nothing more. But the character of resistance was changing. The Fenian movement, dedicated to Irish independence through force if necessary, was gaining strength even in remote Donegal. Young men were drilling in secret, learning to shoot, planning for eventual rebellion. And some of them were tenants on Lord Leitrim's estates. In March 1875, the Earl received an anonymous letter. It was brief and to the point. "Your days are numbered. The people have had enough. Repent or face justice." He showed the letter to the local constabulary, who increased patrols around his properties. He showed it to his friends in Dublin, who advised him to spend more time away from Donegal. He showed it to the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, who expressed concern but offered no real protection. Lord Leitrim's response was characteristic. He had the letter published in the local newspaper, along with his own statement. "I am not a man to be intimidated by cowardly threats from criminal elements. I will continue to manage my estates as I see fit, and I will not be driven from my property by agitators and revolutionaries." The bold words masked a growing unease. He began varying his travel routes. He never announced his plans in advance. He hired additional armed guards to patrol Milford House at night. He started checking his carriage each morning for signs of tampering. He knew that somewhere out there, someone was planning to kill him. He just didn't know who or when or where. In September 1876, another incident crystallized the hatred surrounding the Earl. A tenant named Patrick Doherty fell behind on his rent due to crop failure. The harvest had been poor that year across Donegal, and many families were struggling. Doherty went to the Earl to plead for an extension, promising to pay in full after the next harvest. Lord Leitrim's response was to evict the Doherty family immediately. But this eviction was different from the others. The Earl arrived personally to oversee it, bringing a large contingent of hired men. When Doherty tried to physically resist, arguing that his wife was bedridden with illness and couldn't be moved, the Earl ordered his men to remove her anyway. They carried Mrs. Doherty out of the cottage on her mattress, depositing her on the muddy road while her husband and children watched helplessly. Then they proceeded to demolish the cottage with particular thoroughness, ensuring not a single wall remained standing. Mrs. Doherty died that night, lying on her mattress in the road, exposed to the cold autumn rain. The doctor who examined her body said she had pneumonia and likely wouldn't have survived much longer anyway, but everyone knew what had killed her. Patrick Doherty and his children left Donegal the following week. No one knew where they went. But before he left, Doherty was heard to say, "The Earl will answer for this. If not to men, then to God." If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button and share this with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. Let's discover what happens next in this tale of oppression and retribution. April 2nd, 1878. Just after 8 o'clock in the morning. Lord Leitrim's carriage departs Milford House, heading north toward the coast. It's a journey the Earl makes, regularly traveling to inspect properties and collect rents. This morning he's accompanied by his clerk, Charles Buchanan, and his driver, a man named Makim. The Earl is in good spirits, looking forward to a productive day of estate business. The road winds through the countryside, passing stone walls and empty fields. It's a Tuesday morning and the roads are relatively quiet. A few farmers are out working their land. Some children are walking to school in the distance. The carriage reaches a section of road near Cratla Wood, about 3 miles from Milford House. Here the road narrows, hemmed in by stone walls on both sides and overshadowed by trees. It's a perfect place for an ambush. 3 men step out from behind the wall. They're wearing long coats and have scarves wrapped around the lower portions of their faces. 2 carry shotguns. The third has a pistol. They don't shout warnings or make demands. They simply open fire. The first blast catches Makim, the driver, in the chest. He topples from his seat, falling heavily to the road. The horses rear and scream, but they're trapped between the narrow walls with nowhere to run. Charles Buchanan tries to exit the carriage, perhaps thinking he can reason with the attackers. The second blast cuts him down before he can speak. He falls across the carriage steps, blood pooling beneath him. Lord Leitrim emerges from the carriage, finally understanding what's happening. He reaches for the pistol in his coat pocket, but his movements are slow, hindered by shock and age. He's 72 years old, and for the first time in his life, he's facing opponents who aren't cowed by his title or his authority. The third man shoots him twice with the pistol. The Earl staggers backward, clutching his chest. But the assassins aren't finished. One of them steps forward with a large stone or wooden club. Witnesses would later disagree about the weapon, and strikes the Earl repeatedly about the head. Lord Leitrim falls to the road. The 3 men stand over him for a moment, ensuring their work is complete. Then they turn and run, disappearing into Cratlock Wood. The entire incident takes less than 3 minutes. A local farmer named Michael Gallagher is working in a field about 200 yards away. He hears the shots but doesn't immediately investigate. Gunfire isn't uncommon in rural Ireland. People hunt rabbits and birds, scare away foxes from chicken coops. It's only when he sees the horses still rearing in their traces, the carriage askew in the road, that he becomes concerned. Gallagher approaches cautiously. What he discovers horrifies him. 3 bodies lie in and around the carriage. Blood soaks into the dirt of the road. The horses are panicking, eyes rolling white with terror. Gallagher can see immediately that all 3 men are dead or dying. He turns and runs toward the nearest cottage to raise the alarm. Within the hour, the scene is swarming with people. Constables from the nearby barracks arrive, trying to secure the area and search for the assassins. A doctor is summoned from Milford to officially pronounce the deaths. Local magistrates appear, beginning the process of investigation and documentation. The bodies present a grim tableau. Makim, the driver, has been shot in the back. He died trying to flee. Charles Buchanan was shot from close range, the blast nearly severing his arm. But Lord Leitrim received the most brutal treatment. In addition to the bullet wounds, his skull is fractured in multiple places. His face is barely recognizable. The attack on him was personal, filled with rage that went beyond mere assassination. The carriage itself provides crucial evidence. The Earl's possessions remain untouched. His gold watch, his wallet containing over 20 pounds in cash, even his expensive coat, all left behind. This wasn't a robbery that went wrong. This was premeditated murder, an execution carried out with military precision. Dr. Thomas Swansea, who performs the initial examination of the bodies, notes in his report, the deceased Earl of Leitrim sustained 2 gunshot wounds to the thorax, either of which would have proven fatal. Additionally, severe cranial trauma suggests repeated blows with a heavy implement. The ferocity of the attack indicates extreme personal animosity. This was not the work of common criminals, but of men driven by profound hatred. As news of the assassination spreads through County Donegal, the reaction is extraordinary. People don't express shock or horror. They don't mourn the death of their landlord. Instead, they celebrate. In the town of Milford, where the Earl had wielded absolute power for decades, people gather in the streets. Someone produces a fiddle and dancing begins. In the public houses, men buy rounds for strangers, toasting the unknown assassins. Whoever they were, one man is heard to say, they've done God's work this day. Similar scenes play out across all of Lord Leitrim's estates. In villages where families had been evicted, where daughters had been preyed upon, where the Earl's cruelty had been felt most keenly, the news is received with open jubilation. One elderly woman, whose family had been evicted 10 years earlier, falls to her knees in the road and offers prayers of thanksgiving. The contrast between the local reaction and the response of the establishment couldn't be more stark. In Dublin and London, newspaper headlines scream about brutal murder and lawless violence. The Lord Lieutenant of Ireland issues a statement condemning this heinous act of terrorism against a peer of the realm. A reward of 10,000 is offered for information, leading to the capture of the assassins, an enormous sum, equivalent to several years' income for a working family. But in Donegal, the silence is absolute. No one claims to have seen anything. No one knows anything. No one will talk. The Royal Irish Constabulary launches the most extensive investigation in Irish history up to that point. Over 50 officers are deployed to County Donegal. They interview hundreds of witnesses. They search cottages and barns throughout the region. They offer immunity to anyone who provides useful information. They find nothing. The wall of silence is impenetrable. Even people who were working in fields within sight of the ambush site claim they saw and heard nothing useful. The assassins vanished into the countryside as completely as if they had never existed. The investigation does identify several suspects based on motive and opportunity. One is Michael McKelwey, a tenant who had been evicted from the Leitrim estates 3 years earlier. Another is Neil Shields, known locally as a Fenian sympathizer and organizer. A third is Michael Harati, whose sister had been a domestic servant at Milford House and had left under suspicious circumstances. But suspicion isn't evidence. The constabulary can't place any of these men at the scene. They have no physical evidence connecting them to the crime. And crucially, they have no witnesses willing to testify. McElwee, Shields, and Harati are arrested in late April 1878. They're held for questioning, subjected to intense pressure to confess or implicate others. All three maintain their innocence. After 6 weeks, with no evidence to support prosecution, they're released. The investigation continues for months, then years, but it goes nowhere. The reward money remains unclaimed. The case remains officially open but effectively unsolved. The truth is that while the constabulary knew these 3 men were likely responsible, proving it in court was impossible. The entire community was complicit in the silence. Hundreds of people knew who had killed the Earl, but not one would speak. It was a form of collective protection, a communal decision that justice had been served and no further action was needed. In the years that followed, rumors and stories circulated about the assassination. Different versions emerged, each claiming to be the true account. In some versions, the assassins were Fenian revolutionaries striking a blow against British rule. In others, they were ordinary tenants driven to violence by years of oppression. Some stories claimed the assassins fled to America immediately after the killing. Others insisted they remained in Donegal, living quiet lives while their neighbors protected their secret. The most persistent rumor involved a young woman named Annie McGee. According to this account, Annie had been one of Lord Leitrim's victims years earlier. Her brother or father or cousin, the stories varied, had sworn vengeance. The assassination was planned and executed by men seeking to avenge her honor and the honor of dozens of other women the Earl had abused. There's no way to verify this story, but it reflects what many people believed, that the assassination was fundamentally about protecting women from a predator whom the law refused to touch. The legal aftermath proved almost as interesting as the crime itself. Lord Leitrim's death intestate, he had made no will, meant his estates passed to his cousin, Robert Clements. The new Earl immediately faced a choice: continue his predecessor's policies or chart a new course. Robert Clements chose wisely. He announced sweeping reforms. Rents were reduced to reasonable levels. Evictions ceased almost entirely. A program of estate improvements began, with investment in better housing and infrastructure. The reign of terror was over. This dramatic change in policy raised uncomfortable questions. If humane estate management was possible all along, why had Lord Leitrim chosen cruelty? The answer seemed to be that he simply enjoyed it. He had the power to inflict suffering, and he used it. His death removed a genuine tyrant from the world, and the improvement in tenants' lives was immediate and undeniable. But there was another dimension to the aftermath that received less attention at the time. In the weeks following the assassination, several women came forward privately to church officials and trusted community members. They told their stories of what Lord Leitrim had done to them. None sought legal action. That was still impossible. But they wanted their truth recorded, witnessed, acknowledged. One priest, Father Patrick McFadden, kept careful notes of these testimonies. His private journal, discovered decades later in diocesan archives, contained accounts from 17 different women. The youngest had been 14 when the Earl first assaulted her. The oldest was 43. Their stories covered a span of nearly 30 years, documenting a pattern of systematic sexual predation. Father McFadden never made these testimonies public during his lifetime. He understood that the women's reputations would be destroyed if their names were associated with such accusations, even as victims. Victorian society blamed women for sexual assault, viewing them as complicit or even initiatory. So the stories remained sealed, known to the church but hidden from the world. The criminal investigation officially closed in 1883, 5 years after the assassination. The file was marked unsolved and archived. No one was ever charged, tried, or convicted for the murder of William Sydney Clements, 3rd Earl of Leitrim. It remains one of the most successful political assassinations in Irish history, successful not just in eliminating the target, but in protecting the assassins completely. The Earl of Leitrim's assassination reverberated far beyond County Donegal. It became a powerful symbol in Ireland's struggle against landlordism and British rule. For the tenant rights movement, the case illustrated the complete failure of the legal system to protect ordinary people from aristocratic abuse. Lord Leitrim had operated with impunity for decades, secure in the knowledge that his class position made him untouchable. The law offered his tenants no recourse, no protection, no justice. When formal legal channels failed completely, extra-legal violence became the only remaining option. This reality made the assassination politically complex. Irish nationalists wanted to condemn violence while supporting the tenant rights cause. British authorities wanted to emphasize law and order while avoiding discussion of why the Earl had been so hated. Both sides engaged in careful rhetoric, dancing around the uncomfortable truth that sometimes tyrants are only stopped by force. The Land War, which intensified in the years following 1878, drew explicit lessons from the Leitrim case. Tenant organizations realized that landlords feared direct action more than they feared legal challenges. The assassination demonstrated that even the most powerful landlord could be held accountable if pushed far enough. This knowledge emboldened resistance across Ireland. Charles Stewart Parnell, the nationalist leader who would dominate Irish politics in the 1880s, once commented privately on the Leitrim assassination. According to a contemporary account, he said, "I cannot condone murder, but I understand it. When the law protects monsters, ordinary people will take justice into their own hands. The solution is not more police, but better laws and humane treatment." The British government responded to the assassination and the broader unrest with a combination of coercion and concession. The 1881 Land Act granted Irish tenants new legal protections, including security of tenure and fair rent provisions. It was the most significant reform of Irish land law in centuries, and it came directly from the threat of more violence like that which had ended the Earl of Leitrim. In this sense, the assassination achieved its goal. It didn't just eliminate one tyrannical landlord, it helped transform an entire system. But there was a darker legacy as well. The complete success of the assassination, with the killers never identified or punished, established a pattern that would repeat throughout Irish history. Political violence became an accepted tool of resistance. The boundary between legitimate rebellion and simple criminality blurred, and the romantic glorification of armed resistance, regardless of circumstances or consequences, became deeply embedded in Irish nationalist culture. Decades later, during Ireland's War of Independence and subsequent civil war, participants would cite the Leitrim assassination as precedent. If killing landlords was justified resistance in 1878, wasn't killing British soldiers or Irish collaborators equally justified in 1920? The moral logic, once accepted, proved impossible to contain. The sexual violence dimension of the case also had lasting implications, though these were less discussed at the time. The Earl of Leitrim represented an extreme example of aristocratic sexual predation, but he wasn't unique. Throughout Victorian Britain and Ireland, powerful men regularly exploited vulnerable women with little fear of consequences. Domestic servants, tenant farmers' daughters, working-class women, all were potential victims of men who knew the legal system would protect them. The silence surrounding these crimes was enforced by social convention as much as by law. Women who accused powerful men of sexual assault faced social ostracism, accusations of gold digging or blackmail, and the destruction of their reputations. It was safer to remain silent, to accept abuse as the unfortunate price of survival in a world controlled by men. The Leitrim case broke that silence, at least temporarily and locally. The community's unified support for the assassins represented an implicit acknowledgement of what the Earl had done. By celebrating his death and protecting his killers, they were saying, "We know what he was, we know what he did, and we consider his death justified." This moment of collective acknowledgement was rare in the Victorian era. More commonly, sexual predation by powerful men remained an open secret, widely known but never publicly discussed or officially addressed. The Leitrim case suggested an alternative, that communities could choose to believe victims, protect them, and hold perpetrators accountable when official institutions failed to do so. Historians still debate whether the assassination should be classified as a political act or a personal vendetta. The truth is likely that it was both. The assassins were probably motivated by a combination of political ideology, personal grievance, and moral outrage at the Earl's treatment of women. They saw no contradiction between these motivations. All were valid reasons to act. The location of the assassination site became symbolically important. For years afterward, locals would pause at the spot where the Earl died, some to say prayers of thanks, others to reflect on the price of tyranny. No formal monument was ever erected. Such a thing would have been too provocative, but the place itself became a kind of informal memorial to resistance. The cottages that Lord Leitrim had demolished remained as ruins across the countryside, slowly being reclaimed by nature. They served as silent testimony to his cruelty and to the human cost of the landlord system. Some families eventually returned to rebuild on their old plots after his death, reclaiming land from which they had been violently expelled. The assassination of the Earl of Leitrim stands as one of history's most complex cases of extrajudicial justice. 3 men ambushed and killed a peer of the realm in broad daylight on a public road. They were never caught, never prosecuted, never punished. The community that knew their identities chose silence over cooperation with authorities. And in the decades that followed, the assassination was remembered not as a crime but as an act of righteous retribution. What drove those 3 assassins to such an act? Was it political ideology, seeking to strike a blow against British landlordism? Was it personal revenge, avenging specific wrongs done to their families or communities? Was it moral outrage at the Earl's sexual predation, a determination to protect women whom the law refused to shield? The answer is probably all of these things. The Earl of Leitrim represented tyranny in its most personal and brutal form. He wielded power without compassion, exploited the vulnerable without remorse, and operated with absolute impunity for decades. When the legal system failed to check his abuses, when the church proved powerless to restrain him, when even basic human decency meant nothing to him, his tenants chose violence as their only remaining option. History offers no simple judgment on this case. The assassination was murder, premeditated and brutal, but it was also the elimination of a genuine predator who had destroyed countless lives. It was political violence, but it was also community self-defense. It was illegal, but many would argue it was not unjust. What this story reveals about human nature is perhaps most disturbing of all. It shows how absolute power corrupts absolutely, how privilege can insulate people from consequences, and how systems designed to uphold justice can instead protect the powerful while abandoning the vulnerable. It also shows that when formal justice fails completely, people will create their own justice through whatever means available. The Earl of Leitrim got exactly what he deserved. But the fact that assassination was necessary to stop him represents a catastrophic failure of law, society, and civilization itself. What do you think drove the assassins to act? Was this justice or murder? Could the Earl have been stopped any other way? Leave your theories in the comments below. And if you found this deep dive into one of Ireland's darkest historical chapters compelling, subscribe to Hypnotic Histories for more lost chapters of history that textbooks won't tell you. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our next investigation into the shadows of the past. The 3 assassins lived out their lives in County Donegal, their identities protected by a conspiracy of silence that lasted generations. They attended church, raised families, worked their land. They lived as ordinary men who had done an extraordinary thing. And when they died, they took their secret with them. The truth died with them. But the memory of what they did, and why they did it, lives on. See you in the next video.